This is another post-apocalyptic story. It's a little different than most of the stuff you may have listened to or read. And the inspiration for this one goes back, geez, I'm 60, probably 50 plus years. My mom used to buy yard sale books, church sale books. And I picked up a paperback, and it was old when I got it, probably in the mid 60s, about an end of the world situation about the wind is what destroys the world. And when I read that book, I just kept thinking, it's got to get better. It's got to get better. The story was interesting. I mean, it stayed with me all these years, but the execution was so bad. It was the very first bad book I'd ever read, and it just kind of blew me away because, because I'd never read a bad book before. They go through all these processes and editing, and they go through a publisher, and they have to be good to be published. And this book was so bad, it just stuck with me. But the idea of wind destroying the world was something I wanted to play with. And this is for an anthology that went out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, again, maybe. And I remember the editor sent me notes on it, and he wanted me to change the ending because it was just too ridiculous and just too impossible. Let me know what you think. I kind of like the little hook I did, or the little twist. I love stories with a twist. So, without further ado, here we go. Winds of Change.
Winds of Change by David A. Simpson. Narrated by Eric A. Shellman. Billy, along with billions of others, was worried. The reports from the experts tried to explain the phenomenon, but it seemed like none of them could agree. One scientist blamed global warming and the shifting sea levels. The next guest insisted it was a passing solar gust, which would dissipate in a few weeks. Preachers declared it a judgment of the gods, and that the angels of the heavens had stopped restraining the four winds. Government officials issued decrees and gave speeches stating the winds would lessen and things could get back to normal shortly. The airwaves were rife with rumors, crackpot ideas, and conspiracy theories about weather modification gone wrong, or the super colliders opening black holes in infinity dimensions. Billy didn't know about all that. He just knew the roof of his shed had been ripped off and the building collapsed not long after. The torn and broken tin flying off towards the woods to wrap around wind-bent trees. He wondered if the insurance company would cover it, or if it would even be in business when this all blew over. They would have so many claims they would probably be bankrupt. He had boarded up the west windows on his house. He wasn't concerned about them getting broken, but there were a few good-sized trees in his yard that would smash right through the roof if the wind picked up. It was nearly noon, but with all the dirt and dust in the air, it seemed like twilight. They lost power yesterday, and it would be a long time before the company could repair it. The winds had to die down first. Billy had moved his family far away from his job. It was a long commute every day, but it was worth it for a place to call their own out in the country, near the Valley of Heroes. The roof on the manufactured stone house was only a few years old, and it was supposed to withstand the gusts of gale-force winds that sometimes roared out of the valley. The problem was the winds weren't gusts, they were constant. They were strong and steady. They were building up speed, and they never let up. Their house sat atop a small rise above the creek. Once it had been the perfect location, with a lovely view of the meandering brook below. Now it was being buffeted non-stop. If only they would have built below the ridge on the downslope. He wished for the 100th time they had put it below the crest. It wouldn't be taking such a pounding. The issue wasn't so much the winds themselves. The house was squat, rounded, and solidly built. It was all the debris they carried. Dirt, sand, leaves from stripped trees, shopping bags, and other trash constantly bombarded the house. They wore it down like a sandblaster. The winds howled and dust made its way inside, forced in through the tiniest cracks and up through the eaves. A lawn chair tumbled and spun across the backyard, bounced off a tree, and disappeared in the gloom. The breezes had started 2 weeks earlier. The forecasters called it a perfect storm, an unusual series of events, loosely related, in a cause-and-effect chain reaction that should have blown itself out. Except it didn't. An underwater volcano in the equatorial sea blew its massive top. The superheated ocean spewed millions of tons of volcanic ash into the air and caused other dormant volcanoes to come to life, adding their own lava and cinders to the atmosphere. Hundreds died from suffocation, and the tsunami hit the coastal towns with giant waves killing tens of thousands more. The cleanup would take years, and the cost would be high. There was worry of global cooling and food shortages from all the ash and debris in the air, but fears were calmed. Soothing voices on the video made assurances. Crop loss in one part of the world could easily be made up elsewhere, the officials declared. Yes, fruit and vegetables might cost a little more, but there wouldn't be worldwide famines. There was no truth to the misleading rumors. The world economy wasn't fragile, they insisted. The winds created by the eruptions were actually good, they said, helping spread the ash and dust over a greater area, lessening the impact. But the winds didn't end. The breezes weren't bad at first, just steady. Days passed before anyone noticed, other than a few weather professionals whose anemometers never stopped spinning. At the air shuttle pads, the wind socks spun in constant motion, but nothing to cause alarm. When the meteorologists started mentioning it on the nightly newscasts, the winds had blown for a week and were steadily picking up speed. Only a little. Only a bit faster each day, but they didn't die down or gust and puff. They remained steady, persistent, and constant. The wind carried gray smoke and fine red dust. Forest floors were swept clean of last year's leaves, and they tumbled, broke up, and added to the tiny blowing particles. The experts tried to explain the phenomenon with charts and graphs, indicating the volcanoes caused unusually warm oceans, and the resulting atmospheric pressure differences created the winds, but things would calm down when the cooler waters from the northern seas arrived. But it didn't. The winds blew steady for nearly 2 weeks, and Billy had been without power for over a day when he stared out of the window at the tumbling lawn chair. He sipped his cold morning brew that was much better when it was hot. He couldn't even get a fire going in the wood burner. The winds whistled down the chimney and blew ash everywhere when he opened the door to try. "We need to get into town," he told his wife, finally reaching a decision. "We need to get a bunch of food before it's all gone, before everybody realizes how bad it's going to get." "You don't think it's going to stop?" she asked, casting a worried glance at their 2 children, eating morning cereals and trying to keep the dust out of their bowls. "Even if it stopped right now," he said, "there won't be any crops this year. Maybe not next year either. This is stripping the good soil and dumping it out in the oceans. It's worldwide, according to the news people." She nodded. "Okay. You think they'll get much stronger? You think the house will hold together?" Billy took a long moment to answer. He felt scared. From some of the stories he read on the feeds before they lost power, he didn't think their house would. There had been a few scientists with a detailed graph showing why the winds kept getting stronger and stronger. He didn't understand all the science behind it, as he was a laborer, but he understood the theory. It took a massive, almost unheard-of amount of energy to get a worldwide straight-line wind blowing. Once accomplished, though, once the head of the breeze caught up with the tail after it circled the planet, it fed into itself. It shoved the breeze a little quicker, picked up speed, and pushed a little harder. The graphs showed the planet as basically the eye of the hurricane. The winds would continue to grow in strength, speed, and power. They didn't have any idea if or when it would stop. It might become a storm like the one on neighboring Jupiter, which raged on the gas giant for as long as anyone knew. First spotted hundreds of years ago, it reached sustained wind speeds capable of destroying anything in its path. 5 times the size of their planet, it might churn on for another 1,000 years. The planetary storm, as the newsreaders called it, may turn out to be the same. It was easy to be fearful at night, to believe in all sorts of strangeness, but it was midday, and he still felt deeply afraid, believing the worst. "I think we need to gather as much gear as we can and head down to the caves in the valley," he finally said, "before it gets any worse." He turned to her as the winds buffeted their house, howled in the eaves, and branches of the trees all danced in the same direction. He wasn't prone to hasty decisions. He was a plotter and a planner who only wanted to keep his family safe. He wouldn't suggest such a thing unless he was certain. The winds weren't natural. They grew in intensity, and he could think of only one protected place. "Get the kids ready," he said. "I'll start packing up the truck with some essentials. We'll go into town, get as much food as we can, and take it to the caves." She nodded and set down the dusty cup of cold morning brew. High above the turbulent surface, the pride of the planet orbited, and the 12 crew members stared in disbelief at what was happening below. They were aboard the space station, the first of its kind. They were nearly through their month-long mission of experiments and clear telescopic photography of the neighboring planets from high above the cloud cover. Commander Adams was lost as to what to do. Nothing like this was in any of the training protocols. The planet below appeared savage. The usual white clouds that hung low and serene above the greenish oceans were whipped around and torn apart, replaced by heavy brown, gray, and red angry maelstroms. When they trained the telescopes on the surface, they could pick out vehicles and trees that sometimes surfaced above it, tumbled by the swirling storms before disappearing again. The only thing rising above the clouds of dust were the mountain peaks and the head of the great statue in the Valley of Heroes. The crew had no contact with the surface. None of the communications systems worked, and fear hung heavy among the astronauts. They waited and watched. The clock ticked away the days, and their food supplies dwindled. Billy drove slowly toward the markets. Visibility was bad, like in a heavy fog, and the windshield already possessed thousands of little nicks in it from debris. He'd tried the wipers once. They flapped so hard he was afraid they'd be torn off. Tumbling garbage cans and plastic toys went flying by them in the dirty air. He could see well enough when they were driving with the wind at their back, but when they turned into it, it took them both staring hard at the road to keep them out of the ditches. The parking lot of the nearest community's market was chaos. Panic had set in, driving everyone to act in ways they never would have thought themselves capable of a few weeks ago. Billy couldn't imagine how bad the cities were. People probably killed each other over food, instead of just the fast and desperate fights he saw when he ran through the broken door. Everyone grabbed whatever they could and tried to reach their vehicle without losing anything to the winds or someone else. He'd left Carla and the kids in the truck, not wanting to risk losing them in the confusion after he saw a small riot. He dashed inside, bent nearly double against the wind with one hand holding his goggles in place, the other batting away flying papers and other debris. He grabbed a cart and ran towards the canned goods and saw that everyone else had the same idea. It was gridlocked with carts and shouting, and the shelves were almost bare. A lot of them were fighting over water, but Billy thought he'd be okay, drinking from the creek that flowed through the bottom part of the cave. Most of these people would be dead soon, he thought. If he was right, and the winds kept getting stronger, within a week there wouldn't be any structures left standing. He zigzagged his way through the maddened shoppers, amazed that some were in the electronics section, gathering up useless gizmos. Maybe they thought the winds would die down soon. Maybe they knew something he didn't. Maybe they were stupid. The sporting goods section was almost deserted. Bigger than most shops in the area, this was the last stop many travelers made on their way to the natural springs or the Valley of Heroes. This was where they would grab last-minute packages of bread, gear they'd forgotten, maybe an inexpensive floater or fishing pole, and, of course, enough distilled spirits to last all weekend. Billy started shoveling case after case of freeze-dried food into his cart. He filled it, and plenty more remained on the shelves. He grabbed a sleeping blanket, heaved it out of the bag, and used it to cover his stash, hiding it from view. If the other panicked shoppers saw what he had, they'd empty the shelves before he could return for another load. He ran for the door and back out into the wind. He trudged beside the cart, pressing his weight against it to keep it from toppling over and spilling everything. He let it slam against the truck, Parking lot dings didn't matter anymore, and dropped the rear hatch. He tossed everything in, yelled that he was going back for more, and ran towards the store, struggling to keep the cart with him. An overloaded one came rolling by at an alarming speed, hit a bump, and tumbled off across the parking lot, bouncing high in the wind. Hundreds of cans were scattered, a few flying away, but most rolled madly on the asphalt. Someone's hard-fought prize, lost in the gloom, biting winds, and flying dust. He watched the cans scatter, and knew the ones that weren't whipped away would wind up against the short stone wall at the end of the parking lot. He bet hundreds of cans were stacked up against it. He'd get down there and collect it all as soon as he made one more run at the freeze-dried foods. Once they were in the caves, they wouldn't be coming out for a while, and when they did, there wouldn't be much left on the surface. Billy struggled back through the broken market doors, getting out of the harsh driving winds and catching his breath. Breathing through the cloth tied around his face was hard, because it was caked with dust. It was better than breathing it all into his lungs, though. He yanked it down, sucked in air, then hurried back to the sports section. The groaning of the building became louder than the constant howling, and he saw one corner lifting off, murky daylight and wind-driven debris forced inside. He remembered how his shed collapsed moments after it lost its roof, and tried to shout for everyone to get out. No one could hear him above the din. They ignored his warnings. He abandoned his cart and ran as the ceiling peeled slowly at first. The beams and plaster broke, cracking it open like a can of vegetables. The wind whistled, then roared. Once it found a grip, the roof ripped free, tumbling into the next building. A chain reaction of collapsing structures followed. Billy threw himself back into the outside havoc as the walls folded in on themselves. A dumpster skidded across the parking lot, and he barely avoided it, blinded by the grit. Papers and branches slapped at him, rubble bit into his clothes and stung his skin. He bounced against his truck and retched at the door, trying to open it against the wind. When she saw him struggling, his wife put her feet to the door and shoved. Between them, he managed to slip in, and it slammed shut behind him. The front of the truck was hammered by another cart, bouncing off the grill. The kids both cried, and his wife's face was a mask of barely contained terror. "We'll be okay," he said, breathing hard. "We'll be safe in the caves, and the tombs are carved from solid rock. They'll be safe, too." "It's forbidden to enter them," she said by rote, a lifetime of instilled teachings deeply ingrained. She touched her fingers to her forehead out of habit, not even realizing she did. Billy didn't argue. She was a whole lot more religious than he was, but if the caves started flooding, he'd convince her to go into the catacombs below the statues. She'd do it for the kids, even if she thought she'd be doomed herself. He hit the accelerator and turned away from the driving wind, putting the back of his truck against it. He wiped at the grit in his eyes, tried to control his fear, and hoped it wasn't too late to make it to the Valley of Heroes. Commander Adams rested his head against the window of the space station, the telescope pushed aside. The head of the Warrior King statue slipped from view. It was the last of the creations formed from their ancestors' hands. It had been built on a leveled mountaintop and towered over the valley for thousands of years. Nothing else, no buildings, no trees, no bridge was higher than the Warrior King. It had always been there and always would. He was a constant in an ever-changing world. Only the mountains stood taller than him. Now dirt and flotsam filled the winds, and the statue disappeared, lost in the blowing red cloud that destroyed everything. It stripped the land bare of any soil. It left no leaf on any branch. It filled in ponds, lakes, and oceans with tumbling trees, broken bits of buildings, and uncountable tons of dirt and sand. He and his crew were lost, doomed to orbit their planet forever, with no way to drop back down to the surface without being destroyed, and nowhere to go even if they could. Billy's heavy truck was low to the ground. Even still, they felt like they were on the edge of being lifted from the road and tossed into the raging storm winds. He went as fast as he dared, now regretting the choice to come in for supplies. The wind increased in speed and intensity. They were heavy with water sucked from the lakes, and he barely saw the road. A massive tree slowly tipped over in front of them, and he couldn't risk accelerating under it. The heavy limbs would crush them. They watched as it crashed down across both lanes, its giant root ball stripped bare of all the dirt clinging to it within seconds. The roots were bare and whipping frantically in the gusts as the great tree slowly started to roll, the winds pushing it across the bare ground. When the path was wide enough, Billy accelerated past it, the branches slapping at their truck. They barely noticed the sounds. The screaming of the winds drowned out everything else. The truck lifted and settled again and again. Each time Billy gripped the wheel tighter and thought it would be the last. This time, he thought, this time it'll start tumbling. The windows will shatter out. We'll all be sucked out to ride the winds as broken corpses. When they finally reached the entrance to the valley and slid between the sheer rock walls, the driving force of the wind that had nearly forced them off the road died down. They were still being battered by the blowing dirt and debris as it scoured the paint and sandblasted the windshield, but in the channel he didn't have to worry about being sent tumbling across the barren lands or smashed by a flying house. "Can we stay here a while?" Carla asked, grateful for the pause in the merciless pounding and rocking they had been taking. "It's only going to get worse," Billy said. "If we stop now, we might not make it. We're close, just around the curve of the hot springs, and I can get really close with the truck. We can crawl to the caves from there." They neared the end of the canyon, and the fierce winds created a wall of air filled with rocks and sand and water from the oceans. Usually this was a breathtaking view into the Sidon Valley. A visitor could see the steam rising from the hot springs, the pyramids of the ancients, and the warrior king statue that towered over everything, his face calm and wise. Billy reached over and took his wife's hand as they started into the brutal, howling pandemonium. The wind snatched the truck from the road and spun them into the air, their screams drowned out by the wail of the vortex. For a few seconds they had a view of the ancient statue as it toppled, the body crumbling into chunks of stone. Its outstretched arm wielding the sword shattered and was carried away. The head landed and rolled a few times to stop facing up into the winds. The planet wobbled slightly as earthquakes tore holes in the surface and volcanoes ejected more ash into the air. Once green and blue and teeming with life, it was completely enveloped in swirling red dust. Continents shifted positions. Mountains crumbled. Oceans were emptied, then filled with sand. "We all agree? 100%. The commander asked for the final time. Each crew member nodded their heads. It had to be done. It was a hard thing, but there wasn't a choice. Their planet was dead, but there was hope they could possibly travel to their neighbor. They knew it held life. The long-distance probes they had sent over the years proved that, and their telescopes showed it was mostly covered in water. They were certain they would find the air breathable. There had been manned missions planned sometime in the future when their space program grew more ambitious, and there had been excited talk of colonization. Although it wasn't designed for it, the calculations showed the space station could make it by riding the solar winds. Once they arrived, they could slow their descent with the parasails and land on one of the vast green continents. They had done the math. The odds were in their favor. It could be done. The only problem was there wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough for another week, let alone enough to feed 12 for the year it would take. "We offer our bodies so our people may live," Joseph said, and the others agreed. They said their goodbyes to one another, tethered themselves firmly with the cables, and stepped into the airlock. They held hands, and the tears froze on their faces as the outside hatch was cracked open. The warm air hissed out, and the icy cold vacuum of space replaced it. They died almost instantly, and within minutes were frozen solid. 10 of them. The 2 crew members remaining stared through the porthole at the stiff, floating bodies of their friends. If they ate sparingly, there would be enough protein to keep them alive until they made it to the blue planet. "Eve," Commander Adams said, as they turned away from the airlock, Open the solar sails and let's ride the light to our new home. This has been Winds of Change, written by David A. Simpson, narrated by Eric A. Shellman. Copyright 2024 by David A. Simpson. Production copyright 2024 by David A. Simpson.